This is an incredibly important video here that I'm about to make. So this is in response to a fellow that states he was on a carnivore diet for 3 years with great result. He'd lost over 100 pounds. Unfortunately, recently he said he had a heart attack. But there are some important points to point out during this video. So let's listen to what he has to say.
I've lost probably 100 pounds in the last 3 years on the carnivore diet. On Tuesday, I had a heart attack. I'm a 50 turning 51-year-old on Halloween. I do have a family history of heart disease. Have had a huge amount of confidence in the carnivore diet, thought it made sense, thought that perhaps the data around correlation with high saturated animal fats and heart disease was either wrong or misleading, or perhaps the studies hadn't taken into account people that also didn't consume sugar and processed foods in conjunction with that diet.
Concerns around saturated fat and heart disease may be overblown because they don't take into account people that otherwise eat healthy. And the reality is they don't. The studies just don't show that. There's no good studies that look at saturated fat consumption in the setting of low sugar or low processed food. Those just don't exist. And in fact, when we look at RCTs, does lowering saturated fat actually prevent heart disease? The randomized control trials that really don't show that, or not strongly to any degree. So that sort of belief is based on a lot of data that's out there. Now, one thing I will say, and this is very important, he was a guy in his middle ages who was extremely obese. Plus, he had a family history of cardiovascular disease. That means that at that time, he was at extremely high risk for having a cardiovascular event, something like probably triple the normal population if you look at data on say 5-year risk. The fact that he lost 100 pounds undoubtedly decreased some of that risk. Undoubtedly, at 100 pounds overweight, he was insulin resistant. There's like a 90 to 97% correlation that if you're significantly overweight, he's at increased risk for the disease. By reducing his weight, he has cut back a lot of that risk, but not all of it. In fact, probably half of that is still residual risk. Don't become fat. Do everything in your power to not gain that excess weight, because you're going to have elevated risk. Maybe some of you guys are familiar with this guy, Angus Barbieri. He was a guy that back in the 1960s, I believe, he went under medical supervised fast. He went from 400 and something pounds down to 180 pounds. Now, and he never regained the weight back. He stayed relatively lean. And guess what? He still died at a very young age. He died at something like age 51 due to what they called obesity-related complications. Again, you have increased risk.
This is really kind of shaking my worldview. I think my LDL numbers were about 140 and my HDL numbers were 45. In the past, I want to say my numbers were higher, and my good cholesterol number was much lower before I was doing carnivore.
He also mentions that his cholesterol actually went down. His HDL actually went up by going on a carnivore diet. Now, these again would be markers of lipid risk that have actually improved. When really obese people go low carb, their lipid numbers actually get better. They see a reduction in their cholesterol, their HDL may go up. Again, these are considered positive benefits, even in the lipid side. Now, when people get really, really thin, the so-called lean mass hyperresponder, the lipid energy model seems to kick in, and then we see an elevation of lipids. But in his case, his lipids got lower. Total cholesterol went down, his HDL went up. The doctor would say, well, that's a good thing. And yet, despite that, still has a heart attack.
I'm a little lost on where to go and what to eat. I mean, I've showed such tremendous discipline in what I have been eating over the last 3 years. Basically eat eggs and meat and mixed nuts. I wish this video would go out to a bunch of people because I want to hear weigh-ins, because it's such a controversial topic.
Well, what I would say is I would continue to do a diet that keeps the weight off, right? Keeps the blood pressure down, insulin resistance down. Those things are still beneficial, and it may still be a carnivore diet, perhaps. I don't know what his lipid panel is. Obviously with a 140 LDL cholesterol, most people would recommend lowering that, particularly in a secondary situation. When we talk about lipid lowering therapy and we talk about is it efficacious, the strongest argument could be made for those people in what's considered a post-secondary situation where they've already had the heart attack. And then how you decide to go about that. Is it dietary adjustments? Is it medications? Is it supplements? Those are all things that can be discussed, and I think that is a valid issue. If you're significantly overweight, you should probably want a CDC score. This is something that can at least give you a little more insight into what's going on. If it's 0, maybe you have a little bit more flexibility with what's going on with your lipid numbers. There's this sort of belief that, if you are without any risk factors and the only thing you have is mildly elevated cholesterol, a lot of people say, well, you can leave it out. Even a lot of cardiologists say, well, maybe we don't need to treat that. That has been the traditional view. And a CAC score could further de-risk people. Sometimes in a low-carb community, people say, well, low-carb diets, no sugar means no heart disease. I don't think that's necessarily true. This is something that we deal with on a daily basis, and we have people that are experts that can guide people through this. So this stuff maybe doesn't need to happen. It may be in this situation a dietary shift was warranted. It may be in this situation supplementation would have been warranted. I will certainly say from my perspective, exercise is cardioprotective. Exercise has been shown to reverse cardiovascular disease. So these are things that I would strongly recommend anyone do. And then whether you want to make the decision not to change your diet or to add medication in becomes a very individualized decision. But you need information with this. Again, I know there are people out there within a low-carb space, within the carnivore space, that say that, cholesterol doesn't matter, it can get as high as you possibly want. And there is some data that shows that in some cases that seems to be true. But is it universally applicable across the board to all people on low-carb diets? I would say probably not. Or certainly we don't know that. We can't make those claims. Okay, this is also a very important point. Heart attacks are extremely, extremely common. Every week in the United States, there's something like 15,000 people die of heart disease and heart attacks. And so the fact that you see some people pursuing any type of diet, whether it's carnivore, keto, vegetarian, vegan, Mediterranean, heart attacks is just not that uncommon. It's not that unusual. You will continue to see people of all dietary persuasions continue to have high amounts of heart attacks. That's just the reality of it. There's the fact that, you improve your cardiovascular risk doesn't bring it down to 0. And you have so many people that start ketogenic low carb diets that are starting from such bad cardiovascular positions. They're significantly overweight, they're pre-diabetic, they're diabetic, they have metabolic syndrome, on and on and on. That population, irrespective of any intervention you do to them, is still going to have a high risk for heart disease. As I said, the best thing you can do is never let yourself get in that position in the first place. I'm writing a new book about this stuff, in fact. And so we want to make sure we teach our children to not become obese, to not become sick in the first place. It's not one of these, oh, I'll fix it later. Oh, I'll just get fat and eat garbage while I'm young, and then I'll just fix it when I'm in my 40s or 50s. It doesn't work that way, guys. Don't allow yourself to get in the position that this guy was to start with. If you are significantly obese with multiple risk factors for cardiovascular disease, at the very least, get some imaging and see where you start, okay? At the very least, if you want to pursue a low-carb, keto, or carnivore diet, get some medical supervision over that. Come check out what we're doing at Revero. Hopefully this is helpful for the fellow that's, suffered the heart attack. I hope that you maybe take some of this in mind and you get better, get well. None of us want to see people get sick, regardless of our dietary preferences. All right, guys, take care. Let me know what you guys think.